Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Summary podcast about the nations. My name's Phil. I'm the host. Until recently, I lived overseas for around 20 or so years. In this podcast, we address topics related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. Today, we have Jamie Dew. He is president of New Orleans Seminary. Jamie has 2 PhDs, one from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom and another from Southeastern. He has been at New Orleans since around 2019, and before that, he was a professor and a vice president of Southeastern Seminary. His wife also has a doctorate, so they're both very educated, both highly qualified to do what they're doing. And Jamie, we're very appreciative of you coming on and talking with us today.
Honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jamie, could we first just talk about how you came to faith in Christ?
Sure, absolutely. Mine is one of those stories of pretty radical transformation. I grew up in a regular low middle class family. I was born in the 70s, and in the early 80s, my parents divorced. I was 7 years old. And just long story short, it rocked me. I was in second grade. It rocked me. And this is the age where I'm learning how to read and things like that. I struggled badly in school, kind of in the wake of that. I was already not doing very well. And then this just really was the straw that broke the camel's back. I ended up failing second grade because I couldn't read. I ended up failing third grade because I still couldn't read, and ended up just doing very poorly all the way through school, elementary school, middle school, and into high school. By the time I was in 8th grade, 9th grade, I was getting into really all the wrong stuff. It's a miracle it hadn't happened before. But by the time I got into high school, I was drinking a lot, smoking a lot of marijuana and things of that nature, and just being kind of a reckless kid, just like a lot of my friends were, to be honest with you. But what was interesting about it is in the midst of all of that, and I think looking back on it, of course, I could have never said it this way or even recognized it perhaps, but I can look back on it now and I can see it so clearly. What was unique about that, though, is that seemingly unlike a lot of my friends, the Lord was just allowing me to see the emptiness of it all very young. And, by the time I was a junior in high school, I ended up getting arrested twice, once for stealing 7 cases of beer from the back of a grocery store with a couple of my friends, and then once for smoking weed in my Jeep one night riding around. And honestly, prior to those 2 arrests, I was already at a point where I remember saying to friends, honestly, and I didn't grow up in church, so I didn't mean this in like some theological way. But I can remember often just saying to my friends, I just feel lost. I feel hopeless. I feel empty. I felt shame. I felt, just brokenness. And then those 2 arrests happened, and those were really the straws that broke the camel's back in that sense too. I ended up, my parents had split up when I was 7. So my father had moved away about 2.5, 3 hours away, 10 years before these arrests. And he'd been begging me to come live with him, and I never would do it. But the night of my second arrest, I knew that if I didn't change pretty radically quickly, then I'd be dead soon, or I'd spend the rest of my life in jail. And I called my dad. It was October 9th, 1994. I called my dad and I said, come get me right now. And he did. And that was the beginning of a journey over the next 8 months that the Lord used to humble me, break me. I was very prideful, a little arrogant, little punk kid. And the Lord used all that to just break my heart and to humble me and bring me to nothing. And I got invited to a youth camp. I'd heard of these things, but I didn't know anything about them really. I got invited to this youth camp, and so I went. June 16th, 1995, at a Centrifuge youth camp, I heard the gospel, which I'd heard a whole bunch of times prior to then. But my heart just wasn't ready, and my life wasn't prepared. But the Lord had prepared me at this point. And June 16th, 1995, heard the gospel again. And the Lord graciously saved me. I threw my life onto Jesus Christ. And I knew that night, honestly, I didn't have language for this. I didn't have even conceptual categories for this back then. But looking back, it was very clear that night, it wasn't just salvation that made sense to me. My whole existence made sense to me now. My very life, which I had never really been able to understand, all my buddies, they had plans and hopes. They wanted to go to college. They wanted to do this. They wanted to have this career, that career. As a kid, I could just never, ever envision what I was supposed to do, what I was supposed to do in my life, and who I am and why I am the way that I am. I mean, I was this articulate little fella, but nothing to say. I had a way with words, but nothing to say. I had these leadership abilities, but I've only ever led people in the wrong ways. And now all of a sudden, throwing my life onto Jesus Christ like that, I knew that I was home, and I knew that my life now made sense all of a sudden. The way that I am and why I am the way I am is like, oh, I can see now what I'm supposed to do. And I knew that night that I was going to spend the rest of my life doing this. And so that was June 16th, 1995. This past summer, I've had the fortune in the last couple of years to go back now and preach at Centrifuge Youth Camps. And this past summer, on June 16th, 2025, 30 years to the very moment, I was standing on the stage at a Centrifuge Youth Camp preaching the gospel to people, 30 years to the very moment. And so that's the Lord, that's the Lord. That's what he does.
Mm. Now, when you moved to live with your father, was that in the Raleigh area, if I remember correctly?
Okay. It was. And so I'd grown up in Statesville, North Carolina, about 35, 40 minutes north of Charlotte. Of course, nowadays Charlotte is just bleeding up into Statesville as well. So it's kind of all the Charlotte area now. But back then it was just a little small dairy farm town, and, lots of cows and lots of beautiful rolling hills and stuff like that. So that's where I'd lived. And then my father had moved to the Raleigh area. And so in October of 94, I moved to Raleigh to live with my dad. And that's where I ended up at Bayleaf Baptist Church. We talked about that a minute ago off camera, but a guy I'd met at school invited me to come to church, and it was at a Bayleaf Baptist Church in North Raleigh, and went to a Bible study. And at that Bible study, it was the very end of my junior year. They invited me to summer camp, which was like a week and a half later. And that's how it happened. And said, okay, sure, I'll go. But it was at Bayleaf Baptist Church. I came to faith, learned how to read my Bible, pray, share the gospel, preached my first sermons, met my wife, got married there to her, got baptized, preached my first sermons, all those things. So it's good times.
Mm. So how did you go from this kid, 17, 18 years old, to God saved you, you met a wonderful lady and getting married. Then you go on to seminary, and then you do one PhD, but not just one, but two. Like, how did all that work out, and how did you get to where you are today? This seems like a bit of a complicated and interesting story. I've been in this role for 6.5 years, and there's honestly, there hasn't been a single day since I became president of New Orleans Seminary that I don't reflect back on that journey and marvel at what the Lord has done, because it's certainly not something that I think any other human could have orchestrated or done. But looking back on it through it now, you can see the parts, you can see the moves he's making in the big chess game to take a kid just like me. I mean, and by the way, isn't that looking biblically? I think a lot here about 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You see your calling, brothers, not many wise, not many noble, not many mighty. God seems to have chosen the nothings, the nobodies, the little guys, the underdogs, the unexpecteds. That's who he picks. And the Bible's filled with him doing that kind of thing. And so, in human terms, my life to go from there to here makes no sense. In terms of God's economy, though, this is exactly the kind of thing that our God does. I came to faith June 16th, 1995. I fell instantly and deeply in love with Jesus Christ. And I started sharing the gospel with everybody. And mentors started pulling me aside, talking to me about my calling. They started talking to me about going to seminary. I'm still in high school at this point. And I said, well, what's seminary? And they said, well, that's a graduate school. And I said, what's a graduate school? Remember, I was not a student. And I said, what's a graduate school? And they said, well, it's something after college. And I was like, whoa, time out. I said, you mean I got to go to college? They're like, oh, yeah, buddy, you got to go to college. So, oh, boy. So I start my senior year in high school, turning my grades around a little bit, graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA.
got into a little junior college named Lewisburg College, north of Raleigh. And I was just trying to prepare because I knew I had to go to seminary one day. And the Lord turned my grades around. But during that year, those 2 years at Lewisburg College, I mean, there were really no believers there at all. There were lots of skeptics, lots of atheists. And I was sharing the gospel with all these people. And they'd have questions because I'm not an academic. They'd have all these big intellectual questions that I couldn't answer. And that bothered me. So I discovered apologetics, and I bought every Norman Geisler book you can find. And I was just reading slowly, I might add, because I'm still to this day a very slow reader, reading very slowly through all those books and falling in love with apologetics because it helped me do evangelism. Graduated from Lewisburg, went to Toccoa Falls College and started taking apologetics and philosophy courses. And that's really where I fell in love with apologetics first, but from apologetics into philosophy. Because for me, I started going through some seasons of doubt and struggle with my faith. And specifically, the kinds of things I was struggling with were philosophical questions. So by the time I graduate college and come back to Southeastern Seminary, which is where I was from and where my girlfriend, about to be fiance, about to be wife is from. I mean, none of the other schools had any shot on me. I wasn't going anywhere else. That's where she was. And I end up there. My first years, I'm still kind of struggling with doubt about does God exist? And honestly, it was my own personal struggles. I mean, I never, ever, ever, ever dreamed that a kid like me with, graduate high school with a 1.6 GPA and failed 2 grades and an incredibly slow reader. I mean, I never dreamed I'd get a PhD. I never dreamed I would be a professor, certainly not a dean or a president. But I had this passion and this burden to defend my faith. And that's what was driving me into apologetics and ultimately in philosophy. And I just knew at the end of my MDiv that I had to keep going. And honestly, the only way to do that was PhD in philosophy. I was scared to death of it. I was intimidated by it. I was not sure at all. In fact, if I was sure of anything, I was sure I couldn't do it. But I got into that and lo and behold, worked my tail off and, ended up graduating with a PhD with a 4.0 GPA and doing well in that. The night I graduated with PhD, I knew I wanted to do some more work. I had originally thought about doing like a Master of Arts at NC State in intellectual history and studying the history of science because I had written the first dissertation on the relationship of theology and science. So I was very interested in that at the time. I was still somewhat interested in it, but not as much anymore. But over time, I was pastoring a church, a little small country church, and I was around death all the time. I did funerals. I did 60 funerals in 8 years. And, the cumulative effect of looking death straight in the face and preaching about souls in heaven and the afterlife really caused almost a second season of doubt and struggle. And this one specifically was about whether or not we actually survive our death. And I did again the only thing I knew to do, and that is study hard. And so that's what drove me to do a second PhD. I had done a PhD the first time in America in a seminary context with believers. I did not want to study in America again. I did not want to study in a Christian context. I did not want to be supervised by a Christian this time. I wanted to have my feet held to the fire. So I ended up University of Birmingham. It was a long process of how I ended up there, but I found this very dear man named Eugen Nagasawa, who's now a professor at Oklahoma University, or the University of Oklahoma. He was my PhD supervisor there, and just a very dear man, wonderful philosopher, an incredible mentor, and studied with him for 8 years. And that was kind of how I did the second. I didn't do it to set out to be a president. I'll tell you that. I just wanted to teach philosophy to Christians. I wanted to help Christians think about their faith deeply and think about it well and defend it and articulate. That's what I wanted to do. But while I was doing that second PhD is also when I was on the faculty by this point at Southeastern, and Danny Aiken, the dean of the college, was promoted to provost, and the dean of the college position was open. And I got an email from Danny Aiken, said he wanted to see me in his office. I didn't know what that was about. I thought I was in trouble, to be honest with you. And I walked into his office and we chit-chat for about 3 seconds. And then he says, "Hey, I want you to be the dean of the college." I was like what? And so for 6.5, 7 years, I was the dean of the college. grinding away at trying to get a college to grow, which in turn taught me a lot about administration, accreditation, fundraising, enrollment, all the parts of the machine that work. I was functionally getting trained to be a president, and I did not know that during any of that time. And January 2019, Dr. Kelly had announced his retirement here in October of 2018. But in January of 2019, the search committee had already started searching. And I got an email from Frank Cox, the chair of the search committee. Someone had given him my name, and he wanted to talk to me. Man, here we are. That's how it happened.
Here you are. And while you were during this time of a process of getting the second PhD, how did you handle that as working at Southeastern full time, being a husband, having 4 kids at this point, if I remember correctly. You're an elder at a church. You're doing all this. How did you handle all that while still maintaining your faith in integrity?
It's a good question. I get asked that kind of question all the time. And I think there's several parts to the answer of it. Number one, just the Lord is faithful. And I don't mean that in a cliche or platitudinal way. Just the Lord I felt like he was calling us to do it. And he sustained us every step of the way. The first PhD I did in 4 years. The second one I did in 8 years. So, part of the answer to that is I just went slow and just took my time and didn't try to kill myself or anything else like that. There've been how most things in life, you envision them being one way and then you do them and they're not that way at all. Every now and then I've had a few things along the way that I envisioned it being one way and it was exactly the way that I thought it would be. And honestly, doing that second PhD is one of those. So my logic was, as a professor, specifically in philosophy, as a professor, here's what I need to be doing just as a guy with a PhD that's a professor at an institution. A guy like me should be writing 1 to 2 journal articles a year and a monograph, an academic book about every 3 to 5 years. And my thought was, why not do all that, but get a second PhD in the process? Why not? And so the American PhD programs, typically you do 8 courses, seminars, where you write a paper for each one of them. It's like going to school again in the traditional way. And then after you're done with all that, you write a dissertation. In the British system, there are no seminars. There are no courses you take. I wasn't taking classes. That's not how those programs work. In the British program, you start day one on your dissertation, and you're just researching and writing. So knowing that, I thought, gosh, I could just write papers every year that I need to be presenting at conferences and trying to get published in books and journals and things like that. And then at the end, start and focus them all so that they progress through an argument. And at the end, put it all together into a dissertation, which I could then later publish. And honestly, that is exactly what I did. Basically harness the work I was already going to be doing as an academic anyway. And, Eugen having a supervisor that's on board with that. And that was actually his vision for how to do this anyway. He told me at the beginning of my journey, he said, Jamie, you need to write 2 to 3 substantial papers a year and along the way, present those at academic conferences and publish them in journals or in books as chapters of books, collections of essays and such. And then at the end, pull it all together for a dissertation, and then let's try to publish that as a monograph. That was exactly his vision, and that's what we did. So I think when it was all said and done, I probably got, from papers that became chapters, I probably got, 10 to 15 conference presentations that I would present at academic conferences, which is stuff I needed to be doing anyway. And I only ended up getting 2 chapters published, one in a journal and one in a collection of essays from an academic conference at Oxford. I presented a paper at Oxford, and it got included in a book from that conference. But that was my chapter on Kevin Corcoran. And then I wrote a chapter against Richard Swinburne that got published in a European journal. And I needed to do that stuff anyway. And then now that the whole thing's done, the whole thing's under contract with Hanover Press to be published as a monograph. So, just kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
So what do you like? Which PhD program do you like better? Do you like the US or the UK? Because I know other people I know people who have done both as well. And there's differences, right? They're very, very different. I know the U.S. has accreditation standards, so you can't do a British PhD in the U.S. I don't, if I understand correctly, the accreditation, but they're very distinct. So how would you compare them, and which one would you like better?
So they're very different in terms of the comparison, very different approaches. And I could talk about this all day long. So maybe I'll try real hard to be brief here. I get asked all the time about which was the better program. And I don't think there's a fair answer to that question. I really don't. I mean, look, I learned way more about philosophy as a whole in my American one. But I feel like my British one taught me a lot more about how to be a philosopher, how to actually myself do philosophy. So, turns out I need both of those, so those are very different. The American one felt, looking back on it, very linear, meaning I wrote a proposal about what I'm going to do and they approved it. And then I started in chapter 1 and I just started going until I got to the end, and there was an argument in there. But the British one was very inductive. We didn't start at chapter 1. He said, write 2 papers a year. And I was like, all right, on what? He's like, you got your outline of what you want to do. Pick what you're most passionate about or what you feel like is the most central, critical piece of it and start writing papers on that. So, looking at the table of contents now of that dissertation, I wrote right in the middle first and then right at the end and then right at the beginning and then right there. And it just kind of did that. And then at the end, it was very inductive that way. Another big difference is the American one, it was much more of a genuinely what we would call a research-oriented degree, meaning my job in that dissertation was to research the hound out of something and demonstrate the research, right? That's what I did. I remember the first paper I wrote for Eugen in England. I gave it to him. I had done that. I had research vomit to him. And when I gave him that paper, I remember when we sat down to start talking about it. We talked about it for about an hour. And, he's a Japanese guy. So they're very polite. They're very kind and gentle and gracious. And despite him being gracious and kind, I could just kind of tell after about 20 minutes, I don't think he likes this paper very much. And at the end, he kind of slides it back over and he's like, hey, let's not do that again. And I have a doctorate at this point. I have a PhD in hand already. And he said that, and my heart hurt a little bit. I was like, ow, like, what do you mean don't do that again? And functionally what he said was something to the effect of, Jamie, it's just research. And at this point, I don't care what any of these other people think. I want to know what you think. I want you to make an argument. So I don't know. I can't say one was better than the other. I learned a tremendous amount of both. All said and done, it made me incredibly versatile. When I went over to England, I will say this. I felt like when I started at England, I was fairly far behind the 8 ball on just ability to argue myself.
Yeah.
But I felt like all of my classmates at Birmingham, when I would go over there, I felt like they were way behind the 8 ball in just overall comprehension of philosophy itself. Like they knew, my peers, they knew their topic like super, 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 super well. Like they were in metaphysics. That didn't mean they knew all of metaphysics. That means they knew their one little subdiscipline very, very well. But the whole field, not as much. The history of that field, not at all. So where I came to the table was so much just history that I could play with, and that was helpful. That was really helpful.
Yeah, there's the beauty about you were overseas for a little while for your degree. Did you just go over there like occasionally just to meet with your professor?
Yeah, so so basically I never moved there. Given the fact that you don't take any seminars, it's just research. I knew that theoretically it was possible to do it without moving there. I knew it, and the truth be told, it depends on the university, the department at the university, and the professor. Because the university could say, sure, you can do it this way, but the department won't. Like University of Durham is this way. When I went, you could do a PhD in theology distance, but you could not do philosophy. And that's interesting. And then even if your university and department say yes, that doesn't mean every professor is willing to do it. So, I knew it was theoretically possible. You just had to find the right situation. So I worked about a couple months researching and finding the right situation. And I entered into a program called Split Location at the time. They don't even have it anymore. But Split Location meant that I lived here, but I had to do 6 months there. And I could do that 6 months all at once. I could break it up month. I could do it, a couple days at a time, just lots of trips. So long story short, I went over there a lot.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The UK, I mean, it's a beautiful place. I mean, so as you well know, so this is that opportunity, I'm sure,
right.
Was impactful to you. I want to ask you a kind of change tune a little bit. You've been saved now for what, about 30 or so years?
Yeah.
What's one thing you wish you would have known earlier, like in the beginning of your salvation when God saved you, that you wish that you know now?
That's a good question. I think about that kind of thing a lot. It's certainly not any of the knowledge or anything else like that. You kind of accumulate that stuff as you go. I think honestly, if older Jamie Dew could talk to younger Jamie Dew, I would have just encouraged him along the way to trust God through the struggle. Because, man, looking back on my life and ministry, I'm not in this seat now as the president of one of the seminaries. There's in the little Baptist ecosystem, folks know who I am, and I walk into the SBC and, most folks in that room will know who I am. My life has not been that, though. My life has been one spent in obscurity. I was not known. I was not sought after. I was not a big name. I was none of those things for honestly, the vast majority of my history prior to becoming president of this school. And I can remember even when I was elected president or when I was announced that I was the candidate, my name's Jamie Dew, but the question throughout the SBC was, Jamie who? Like, who is this guy? I mean, that was unheard of. Nobody knew who I was. And I'll be honest with you, early when I was young, in my late 20s, in my early 30s, that was really hard. That was really hard because, I mean, I was being faithful. I was trying to be at least. And I was very articulate. So, I mean, as a preacher, I felt like I was a decent preacher. And yet I wasn't one of these people that every big church was trying to steal me away from the little church I pastored. I was unknown. I mean, all my friends, it was a constant thing of, I get asked by this church to leave my church and come be a pastor. Nobody ever asked me to leave my church, for a bigger church or anything else like that. And there were other people that were getting the academic opportunities before I was, and I wasn't connected. And man, I struggled in obscurity early, especially. And it just took a while, for the Lord to condition my heart and embrace it and see it. And now that I sit where I'm at, I can look, I like getting older. I really do. I like getting older because I feel like I can see with so much more clarity now. For instance, to your question, man, I can look back now and the struggle is part of what made me who I am. The struggle, it wasn't the degrees. It's not the publications. It's not the successes. It's the struggle that actually formed me into who I am today and enables me to give me the depth and the gravitas to stand in the moments that I'm in right now, right? And second, I struggled with that obscurity, especially when I was young. But I see God's grace in it now. I mean, the worst possible thing the Lord could have done would be to inform me or somehow let me know that I was going to be the president of a seminary one day. I mean, can you imagine how arrogant I would have been? I mean, it would have just ruined me if he had done it. But, and I've learned, and this is the thing I would say to the younger Jamie Dew, I've just learned that often the Lord is concealing layers that you're not supposed to see because you can't handle it. Just trust God in the middle of that struggle. And, it would have given me hope. It would have given me encouragement,
So through this process, if you getting married, I believe in your 20s or so, kind of early on in your ministry career. Okay. How did your wife and your family play a role in your ministry? Family is pretty, is pretty important to you. I understand that. So can you articulate that, and can you explain the importance of family in your own ministry and your own walk with Christ?
Yeah. I say to young men and young women all the time, especially single ones, and I hate to be the guy to say it in a scary way, but man, when it comes to who you marry, don't mess that up. Don't mess that up. I look back and, I remember as a young man, mentors telling us that If you made a list of all your 20 friends that are going into ministry as a young man, in 20 years, 19 out of 20 of them would not be there anymore. And then we all swore that wouldn't happen and that couldn't be true. And man, that is exactly what has happened. And when I look back on it, most of my friends that have lost their ministries have also lost their marriages. And most of their marriages and ministries were lost because they were not attentive to their marriage and to their family. So I do think it matters who you marry, right? If you and your girlfriend or boyfriend, if one of you is called to do something, the other one's not, if there's not alignment, it doesn't mean you got to have it figured out on exactly what you're going. But man, if there's not just a base level alignment on, no, we're going in the same direction, we're going to serve the Lord Jesus together, then man, don't do it. Don't do it. Because they may tolerate your ministry for a while, but that's not going to work. It just won't work. It matters who you marry. It matters how you go about marriage. I had the good fortune of marrying Tara Dew. Holy smokes. What a fortune to me. Folks that know us and know us well know. And, everybody jokes about this. Every pastor jokes about, and every church jokes with their pastor about it. Like, we only tolerate you so we can have her. That's like legit true with me. Most people, my wife is the most bubbly, outgoing, genuinely caring, loving person you'll ever meet in your life. And here I am, this sort of gruff, rough around the edges guy. And the Lord brought us together. I'm at 30,000 feet. She's down in the details. She and I could not be more opposite than we are. And I think we actually become more and more opposite as we go through this longer. And yet somehow this works really well. But I've married someone, you were talking about the pace. How do you go about doing this? Part of the answer is this is all we've ever known for 25 years of marriage. We got married. She was a sophomore in high school. Not in high school. Sorry. She was a sophomore in college. I was a first-year seminary student, and we both had full scholarships, but we also both had 3 part-time jobs, and we called it dueling laptops. We'd come home from school or work, and we'd sit there at night, and we'd write papers, and we'd read our books. We'd do our homework. We'd go to bed at 11 or 12 at night every night, tired. And we've been at that pace the whole time. And people ask with my busy role, like, how's your wife handle you being gone all the time? Shoot, if I wasn't gone all the time, she'd be gone all the time. She works harder than I do. So I don't know. We just figured it out. And then in the midst of all that, the Lord gave us not 1, but 2 sets of twins. And, 2 sets of twins will slow you down and force you to focus on home no matter what. And that's a gift to us because it's forced us over the years to just really work hard to prioritize, not, family at the expense of ministry. Oftentimes it was them coming with us to do ministry. It was not something that mom and dad do. It's something that the Dews do. The Dew crew does this. And our children just embrace that. And we had fun and we'd laugh. And to this day, almost every night, even though I've got 2 in college now, almost every night the day ends with all of us on a FaceTime call, touching base, picking on each other, laughing at each other, and praying together. And we still do that. And that's just been a very rich life.
That's very sweet. And that's a testimony to how the Lord has persevered you. And that's, by God's grace. And, and that is, but it's a beautiful thing to see that because you and I both know a lot of the same people where that hasn't happened. So, Now, as president, you probably get asked this question a lot too, but what piece of advice would you give an incoming seminary student or someone who's just thinking about going into ministry?
Yeah, so somebody going into ministry and these 2 statements, I'm going to say, have to hold them together in tension, but they're going to feel like they cut the wrong opposite directions. On the one hand, I'd say to somebody considering seminary, I would say to them, drill your wells deeply. And part of what I mean by that, at least, this is not the sum total of it, but part of what I mean by that is go to seminary. Go to seminary, especially if you're young. Get as much as you possibly can. Baptists are weird in that, your churches you're going to go serve, they don't require you to have any degree. And quite frankly, they're going to try to steal you away to serve in their church before you're finished with your degrees. That's how it's going to work. But having said that, the metaphor I use biblically is drill your cisterns deep. My days of getting to sit around and prepare for sermons like for hours and hours are kind of gone. But the good news is my whole life has been preparation, right? I pastored a church where I preached a different expository sermon every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And, the biblical studies undergrad, the MDiv, the 2 PhDs, the books I've written. Man, my whole life has been prep. I got material coming out my ears after 30 years of doing that. And I get to draw on that now every day. And the 48-year-old me today thanks the 28-year-old version of myself for doing that work. So on the one hand, I'd say get as much as you can in terms of training. You will use every bit of it. So you can go do a lifetime of ministry. Why do you want a well that's that thin? And to be specific here and push back and maybe even be controversial here a little bit, I'm not trying to be, but there's a generation of people going into ministry that are just getting terrible advice and lots of the wrong pressure on them. The idea is today is, you don't need to go to seminary. You can learn that in our local church. Well, you know what? You can learn how to do a lot of things in the local church. There's no question about that. But a local church is not the same thing as going to a seminary and having a theological community to learn New Testament, Old Testament, ethics, theology. Drill your cisterns deep. That's number one. Number two, this is where hold these in tension. They feel like they cut in the opposite direction. Drill your cisterns deep. Do not reduce your preparation to just your education, and do not reduce your faithfulness in ministry to mere theological faithfulness. What happens when you go to seminary is that you can replace your personal spiritual life with this very academic professional thing. And when you do that, you are destined to destruction. I've watched it happen. It almost happened to me personally. And I've watched it happen with hundreds of my students over the years. Just don't do that. Don't reduce. You've got to maintain and continue cultivating the very spiritual disciplines that send you to seminary in the first place. But a lot of students don't. I'm studying theology and New Testament in my class. I don't need to do my quiet time over here. And yes, I know that quiet time is so cliche sounding and everything, but look, get over the cliche, spend time with Jesus, You just got to do that. And those are mistakes I see people make all the time. Either minimize the need for it or reduce it to just get your degree and you're supposed to be good. Neither one of those are going to work real well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you a couple more quick questions.
Sure.
Maybe not so quick, but what's one thing that we could promote on your behalf? How can people help you in your ministry? You're president of New Orleans. You've been there, for a while now. Lord's blessed you in your ministry there. But is there anything that we can promote? Is there anything you'd like to promote?
Two things I would promote. One very personal and spiritual. One very practical. Number one, pray for us. Pray for us. Look, this is joyful work. It really is. I'm not saying pray for us because, poor us. This is hard. Yeah, it's hard being president of a seminary. And yeah, it's hard leading a school. And there's all kinds of challenges. It is joyful, though. It is very joyful to get to do. But it's hard. The environment that we live in, and by we here, I don't mean just NOBTS. I mean your 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. Pray for me. Pray for Al Moeller. Pray for Jason Allen, Danny Aiken, or whoever the next guy's going to be. Pray for Adam Croza, pray for David Dockery, pray for us, because the environment that we live in is less and less conducive to our existence every day. It just is, there is a bit of a cultural shift right now in the last 6 months that kind of is giving a little bit, taking some pressure off, and we're thankful for that. But I know what's going to happen. The pendulum's just going to swing back the other direction. And so pray for us. We need that. And I'm always encouraged. I have people praying for me every day, and I feel it. And there's things that will happen where I thought this bad thing could come. And then all of a sudden I get news that the bad thing didn't come. And I'm like, man, wow, how about that? I wonder how that happened. And then that night on Facebook, I'll get a couple messages from folks saying, hey, man, you had you on my heart today praying for you. And I'm like, well, there we go. It's right there, So pray for us. That's one. And specifically pray for just wisdom and guidance and provision on how we navigate things, but also pray for just spiritual holiness. Pray for those things. Second, to your listeners, however many they are, please, yourself and your church, don't give up on the cooperative program. Please. Look, this is genius. This is glorious that we have this. We are the marvel and the envy of the entire evangelical world to have this mechanism, but it's fragile and it is, I don't want to say dying, but it is weakening with every passing year. Together, we are the largest missiological force in history. Let that sink in.
Yeah.
That's massive. And yet it doesn't have to be that way. And it won't be that way if we lose a cooperative program. Together, we are training more people for gospel ministry in theological and practical ways than ever in history. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it won't be that way if we give up on the cooperative program. Most of our generation today doesn't even know what this thing is. They certainly don't know how it works. When they feel the budget pressures in their church, that's going to be the first thing to go. When they get mad at this thing or that thing in the SBC, there's some church over there in a whole nother state that said this or did this. They pull their money back out. And you know what? That's however much that logic makes sense in the initial framework context you're in the broader context and the broader horizons, that's very destructive behaviors. And I would beg people, don't give up on this. It's worth continuing.
Do you think that the U.S. is moving towards more of a post-Christian society, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why that a cooperative program isn't where it needs to be, or is it more of or is it a deeper issue than that?
Yeah, when we watch the cultural movements of our day, it's very interesting how we see these things play out, because I think there's a sense in which we see two different streams cutting in opposite directions that are both true. I do think it's the case that in the American mindset, in the Western mindset, that increasingly more people do not identify as religious in any way. I mean, we know that from the basic stats and the polls and things that increase the people that identify as the nuns, those numbers are just skyrocketing and going up. And so, yes, I think the fabric of our culture has been for the last, decades now, moving further and further away from any type of theological or Christian identity. I do. I think it is also true, on the other hand, that at our current moment, we're actually seeing some encouraging signs of openness to the gospel, hunger for Christianity, maybe even some little precursor signs of some revival that sits on our doorstep. And that, while those two sound like they might be contradictory, I actually think you can't have that second one, or you're probably not going to have that second one without the first. Meaning, because we thought that everybody's a Christian, nobody felt the need for God. But now that you feel the darkness, so to speak, is a little more palpable and the rejection a little more clear, well, then now, yes, people see the contrast of the gospel and a hunger for it. And I think at the end of the day, look, people will say all kinds of things about what they want and what they don't want, what they affirm and what they don't affirm. But I think at the end of the day, the way the human psyche works, what most people are seeking after is the very thing that Jesus Christ has to offer. So as the world gets darker, I think the opportunity for the gospel gets greater.
With your last question, I think, sure. With your 2 PhDs and you being in ministry for as long as you've been in, there has to be like a couple books that have really just impacted you. I talked to Scott Hildreth, a couple months ago and asked him this question, and he said it was "Let the Nations Be Glad" by Piper. Are there any books that are like that for you? They don't have to be pastoral, they don't have to be academic, but a couple books that have impacted you probably more than anything that you would recommend to people.
Yeah, there are. And I get asked this question all the time. And, it doesn't help that Al Mohler is my colleague over there. And he's, people think I'm doing what he's doing, just sitting around reading, all these big, fancy, heady books all the time. Most of the books I'm reading these days are reloading manuals on how to make my own rifle bullets for hunting. I mean, that's what I read today, and I doubt people want to read that. I love that kind of stuff and hunting and all that stuff. So for hobbies, that's what I do. But academically and maybe, even theologically, I remember I had a professor once long ago was my first semester in PhD program, made the comment to us. It's just a throwaway comment, but it made sense to me. He said, brothers, you ought to familiarize yourself very greatly with one contemporary theologian and one ancient historic one. And that stuck. There's more than one, especially in the ancient stuff. But here are a couple. Here's the big ones. I mean, Alistair McGrath has had a deep impact on the way I think through modernity, postmodernity, religious epistemology, my approach to natural theology. I'm deeply indebted. Not that I agree with everything McGrath says, but I am deeply indebted to Alistair McGrath and specifically his work in natural theology, which is one of my major areas of expertise, or I've spent my career doing. And so Alistair McGrath's work, specifically in the early 2000s, he wrote a trilogy called Scientific Theology, or A Scientific Theology. A little one-volume, it's a 3-volume set. He has a 1-volume book called The Science of God, which is kind of going through a lot of the same material if people want to read those. Very influential for me in terms of setting framework on how I think through some of these epistemological issues. Next, and then probably very few people are going to read this one, but it's Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica. I get asked sometimes, are you a Thomist? Yeah. My hesitancy is Thomas wrote 8 million words. He wrote on everything. I mean, I haven't wrapped my head around everything Thomas has said. So I'm careful that I come across like I'm the guy representing Thomas. But I know this, when it comes to what we believe about human persons, body, soul stuff, Thomas Aquinas is the guy that's influenced me more than anybody. And I consider my view a modified version of Thomism on this, some kind of modified hylomorphic view that he's got. And those two things have really shaped me. I should also say that because I'm influenced by Thomas, there's a sense in which Aristotle has had a big impact on me as well. My favorite ancient philosopher is Plato, even though I'd probably be more Aristotelian. I can't stand reading Aristotle, except for Nicomachean Ethics. I love reading Plato. Just, folks, go buy yourself the complete works of Plato and sit back and enjoy sometimes if you really want to read some good philosophy. And then Augustine. I used to teach at Southeastern history of ideas, and these were my favorite readings. Of course, Descartes and Bacon and all these guys too, Locke. But those would be the big ones that have had a deep impact on my mind.
Well, hey, Jamie, thanks for joining us. I appreciate your time, especially busy time for you right now. So I appreciate you taking an hour and a half out of your time just to talk with us.
Absolutely. Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.